Deep in the Amazon's most remote territories, hunters speak of an encounter that ends careers. You're tracking to peer through dense undergrowth when the forest goes silent. No insect buzz, no bird call, nothing. Then the smell hits, rot and musk so thick it burns your throat. You turn, and 20 feet away stands something that shouldn't exist. A towering mass of reddish fur, 3 meters tall, arms hanging to its knees, a single eye fixed on you from a face that seems almost human. But the horror crystallizes when the thing's belly opens, a vertical mouth ringed with teeth, and from that impossible orifice comes a sound somewhere between human scream and howler monkey rage. The indigenous peoples of the Amazon have a name for this terror, Mapinguari, and they insist it's not legend, it's a neighbor they've learned to avoid. The word itself carries weight in dozens of tribal languages across the basin. Among the Caritiana people of Rondonia, Mapinguari translates roughly to the thing that has a fetid smell, or the roaring animal. The Ngatu-speaking communities along the Rio Negro know it as Mapinguari, describing encounters in hushed tones around fires. The Kayapo call it Irapuru in some dialects, though the description remains chillingly consistent across hundreds of miles and dozens of unrelated languages. What emerges from these oral histories isn't the vague monster of campfire tales. It's a creature described with the precision hunters use for jaguar or anaconda, an animal they claim to know as intimately as any catalogued species. The physical description holds remarkable consistency. Standing between 2 and 3 meters tall when upright, the Mapinguari moves primarily in a hunched, knuckle-walking gait that recalls a massive ground sloth. Its body is covered in thick, matted fur, ranging from reddish-brown to nearly black, coarse enough that arrows supposedly bounce off or get tangled in the dense coat. The arms extend disproportionately long, ending in curved claws measuring up to 20 centimeters, not the retractable claws of cats, but permanent bone-tipped weapons, ideal for tearing bark and flesh alike. But the truly disturbing features separate Mapinguari from any known animal. The single eye, always described as centrally located in the face rather than paired like every mammal science recognizes, reflects light at night with an eerie green or red glow. Some accounts describe the eye as unblinking, others claim it closes sideways like a reptile's nictitating membrane. And then there's the mouth in the belly, a vertical slit in the torso that opens to reveal rows of teeth, from which emanates both the creature's signature stench and its territorial roar. This abdominal mouth allegedly serves as the primary feeding apparatus, though how this anatomical impossibility could function remains unexplained, unless, of course, the creature exists as described. The Mapinguari's behavior patterns emerge consistently across tribal accounts. It's primarily a forest dweller, favoring the densest, most remote stretches of terra firma rainforest, where human presence remains minimal. Unlike the jaguar's ambush tactics or the anaconda's patient waiting, the Mapinguari allegedly employs psychological warfare. Witnesses describe how it announces its presence from a distance, the penetrating stench arriving first, carried on shifting winds, followed by roars that seem to come from multiple directions simultaneously. Hunters report feeling compelled to move toward the sound rather than away, a hypnotic pull they struggle to explain. Some indigenous accounts describe the creature as having the power to confuse prey, making experienced trackers lose all sense of direction within familiar territory. The smell deserves its own taxonomy of horror. Those who've allegedly encountered the Mapinguari describe a stench that combines decomposing flesh, concentrated urine, and sulfurous compounds, a smell so intense it induces nausea and disorientation. One Munduruku hunter told researchers that the odor lingers for days after an encounter, impregnating clothing and gear to the point that items must be abandoned. This olfactory weapon may serve multiple purposes, marking territory, deterring competitors, or as some shamans suggest, containing compounds that alter consciousness and create the confusion witnesses report. The creature's diet, according to indigenous sources, consists primarily of palm hearts and forest fruits, which would align it with herbivorous megafauna. But numerous accounts describe the Mapinguari attacking humans who intrude on its territory, and bodies of hunters found mauled beyond recognition are sometimes attributed to its work. The Caritiana people maintain that the creature is especially aggressive on certain days of the lunar cycle, becoming frenzied and territorial when the moon wanes. Whether these attacks represent feeding behavior, territorial defense, or something else entirely remains one of the creature's many mysteries. The earliest written documentation of Mapinguari encounters comes not from scientists, but from rubber tappers and missionaries penetrating the deep Amazon in the late 19th century. In 1891, a Catholic mission report from the Javari Valley describes a demon covered in hair that walks like a man but roars like no earthly beast. The priest who filed this report, Father Anselmo d'Almeida, claimed indigenous guides refused to enter certain territories during specific times of year, speaking of a creature that bore the mark of God's punishment upon its form, a possible reference to the aberrant anatomical features. Father d'Almeida recorded testimonies from 3 different tribal groups, each describing the same essential creature despite having no contact with each other across hundreds of kilometers of forest. The rubber boom of 1879-1912 brought thousands of workers deep into previously unexplored Amazon territories, and their accounts begin appearing in regional newspapers and company logs. A 1904 dispatch from Manaus describes a seringueiro named Paulo Santana, who stumbled into a Belém hospital, barely coherent, his back raked with claw marks too large for jaguar. He insisted a giant sloth man with one eye had attacked his tapping station, killing 2 companions. The company official who investigated found the camp destroyed, trees knocked down, equipment scattered, and 2 bodies so mutilated that identification proved impossible. The official's report, preserved in the Amazonas State Archives, carefully avoids naming a creature, but notes signs of struggle with animal unknown to current zoological classification. Percy Harrison Fawcett, the British explorer who vanished seeking lost cities in 1925, made marginal notes in his journals about creature reports that sound remarkably like Mapinguari. In a 1914 entry, Fawcett writes of Kalapalo informants describing a forest giant that walks upright but is no man, whose gaze can stop the heart. He sketched a crude figure in the margin: hunched body, disproportionate arms, a notation that reads, "Mouth wrongly placed," though Fawcett dismissed the account as fever dream mythology. He notably altered his planned route to avoid an area the Kalapalo identified as the creature's primary territory. The Brazilian military expeditions of the 1940s and 50s, surveying the Amazon for strategic purposes, generated several declassified reports that dance around acknowledging something unexplained. A 1948 survey team working the Purus River headwaters reported their camp being circled for 3 nights by something that left footprints measuring 43 centimeters long and 18 centimeters wide, far larger than any catalogued Amazon mammal and vaguely humanoid in shape. The team's radio operator described a smell like a corpse soaked in ammonia and roars that didn't match their recordings of any known animal. The official report classified these observations as unidentified fauna, possibly displaced bear species, despite South America having no bear species in lowland rainforest. In 1975, Swiss researcher Johann Renger interviewed over 80 indigenous people across 6 tribal groups about fauna reports. His published findings, largely ignored by mainstream zoology, documented Mapinguari encounters with ethnographic rigor. Renga noted that descriptions remained consistent even among tribes with no cultural contact. Always the single eye, always the belly mouth, always the overwhelming stench. He recorded 17 separate incidents where hunters claimed direct sightings, 11 cases of destroyed camps or equipment, and 3 alleged human deaths attributed to the creature within the previous decade. What struck Renga most forcefully was the matter-of-fact nature of these reports. The indigenous informants described Mapinguari with the same casual certainty they used for tapir or peccary, an accepted part of the forest ecosystem. Perhaps the most compelling historical account comes from veteran guide Jorge Serafim, whose 1988 encounter was documented by multiple witnesses and investigated by Brazilian authorities. Serafim was leading a botanical survey team near the Javari Valley when at mid-morning the forest went silent in a way he'd never experienced in 30 years of jungle work. The stench arrived moments later, and Serafim ordered his team to freeze. Approximately 50 meters away, moving through dense understory, he saw what he initially mistook for a massive tapir until it reared upright. Serafim's description, given within hours to authorities and unchanged in subsequent interviews, matches indigenous accounts with precision. Reddish-brown fur, single centrally placed eye, arms extending to the knees, and a vertical opening in the torso from which came a roar that felt like it vibrated inside my skull. What makes Serafim's account particularly valuable is that all 5 team members witnessed the encounter, and 3 were credentialed scientists with no cultural preconceptions about Amazonian cryptids. Dr. Helena Andrade, the team's lead botanist, later told investigators that she watched the creature for approximately 3 minutes before it dropped to all fours and disappeared into vegetation. She noted that its gait resembled a bear's butt with more upright posture, and that the eye, definitely singular, tracked the group with clear, intelligent focus. The team retreated immediately, and none could be persuaded to return to that area. Soil samples and vegetation analysis from the encounter site showed elevated sulfur compounds and dead insects, though whether this connected to the creature's reported smell or other environmental factors remained unclear. The scientific community's response to such reports ranges from dismissal to cautious interest, with a frustrating absence of middle ground. Mainstream zoology categorically rejects the possibility of a large unknown primate in South America, noting that the continent's primate evolution followed a completely different path from African and Asian species. Dr. Mark van Roosmalen, the Dutch primatologist who's discovered several new Amazon monkey species, acknowledged in a 2002 interview that the Amazon holds species we haven't catalogued, but a 3-meter bipedal primate with anatomical features seen in no known mammal stretches credibility to breaking. However, Van Roosmalen stopped short of absolute denial, adding, "I've been surprised enough times to remain humble about what the forest might hide. The single eye presents the most significant anatomical obstacle to acceptance. All terrestrial vertebrates display bilateral symmetry. Paired eyes are fundamental to vertebrate evolution, stretching back hundreds of millions of years. Cyclopia, the condition of single-eye development, occurs only as a fatal birth defect in mammals. No viable cyclopic mammal has ever been documented. Yet every Mapinguari account specifies this feature with such consistency that dismissing it as collective hallucination becomes problematic. Some researchers have suggested that the single eye might be a cultural interpretation of an animal with very close-set eyes or a distinctive facial marking that creates an optical illusion. But this explanation requires assuming hundreds of independent observers across decades and vast distances all made the same visual error. The belly mouth presents an equally insurmountable biological puzzle. No known animal feeds through an abdominal orifice. The evolutionary path to such anatomy has no precedent and no theoretical viability. Doctor. Gustavo Fonseca, who's studied Amazon megafauna for 3 decades, suggests the bellymouth might be misidentification of wounds, a pouch, or visible skin coloration that creates mouth-like appearance. But, he concedes, the specificity of the descriptions, witnesses describe teeth, vocalizations originating from this orifice, makes simple misidentification unlikely. Either people are seeing something we don't understand, or there's a shared cultural narrative so powerful it overwrites individual observation. Enter the giant ground sloth hypothesis, and suddenly elements of the impossible begin clicking toward plausibility. South America was home to enormous ground sloths, Megatherium, Erematherium, Mylodon, that survived until roughly 10,000 years ago. These animals reached heights of 4 to 6 meters when upright, possessed massive claws, and moved in a knuckle-walking gait when on all fours. Indigenous oral histories in South America demonstrably preserve information across thousands of years. Tehuelche legends in Patagonia describe giant sloths with accuracy that could only come from direct ancestral observation. Could the Mapinguari represent a relict population of ground sloths surviving in the Amazon's most impenetrable refuges? Dr. David Oren, an American ornithologist working in Brazil, became the academic face of this hypothesis in the 1990s. After interviewing over 100 witnesses and examining physical evidence, including hair samples and track casts, Oren proposed that Mapinguari represents a surviving Mylodon adapted to rainforest habitat. He pointed to the creature's reported herbivorous diet, the massive claws perfect for stripping bark and digging for palm hearts, and the knuckle-walking locomotion, all consistent with ground sloth anatomy. The smell, Oren suggested, might be defensive secretions from skin glands. Many extinct sloths showed evidence of such glands in fossil remains. But Oren's hypothesis doesn't address the single eye or belly mouth. He speculated that the eye might represent bioluminescent facial markings. Some ground sloth coprolites show evidence of consumed fungi that could theoretically produce bioluminescent compounds. As for the abdominal mouth, Oren suggested a throat pouch or vocal sac that, when inflated during territorial displays, might appear mouth-like. But he acknowledged this remained speculative. His hair samples, submitted to multiple labs, returned inconclusive results. Mammalian, certainly, but too degraded for species identification and showing no match to any catalogued animal in genetic databases. The hypothesis received support from an unexpected source. Paleontologist Dr. Alex Kellner discovered in 2010 that certain Erematherium skeletons showed evidence of dermal ossicles, bony plates embedded in the skin. This might explain the reports of arrows bouncing off Mapinguari's hide. If a surviving ground sloth retained this feature, it would possess natural armor beneath the fur. Additionally, analysis of Mylodon remains from Chilean caves revealed evidence of extremely thick skin, up to 2 centimeters in some areas, far denser than any living mammal. Yet the timeline presents problems. Every dating method places ground sloth extinction firmly around 10,000 years ago, with the most generous estimates allowing survival to perhaps 8,000 years before present. For Mapinguari to represent living ground sloths, a breeding population would need to have persisted through 10 millennia without leaving fossil evidence, without being documented during earlier colonial periods, and without population genetics revealing themselves in environmental DNA sampling now being conducted throughout the Amazon. The silence in the biological record is deafening, yet the consistency of eyewitness accounts remains equally loud. Other scientific explanations struggle to gain traction. Some researchers propose the Mapinguari represents mistaken identity of known animals observed under unusual conditions. The giant anteater, while smaller than reported Mapinguari, does walk upright occasionally, possesses powerful claws, and moves with an unusual gait. But anteaters lack the bulk, the aggressive territorial behavior, and any feature resembling a centralized eye or abdominal mouth. Spectacled bears, South America's only bear species, inhabit Andean cloud forests and occasionally range to forest edges, but documented encounters with Amazonian lowlands are extraordinarily rare, and bears possess two eyes and mouths in the usual locations. The hallucination hypothesis, that witnesses experience similar visions triggered by natural compounds, has some ethnobotanical support. Amazon shamans use dozens of psychoactive plants, including ayahuasca and datura species, that produce consistent hallucinatory patterns across users. Dr. Eliana Boyer, who studied indigenous pharmacology for 2 decades, notes that certain compound combinations produce visions of amalgamated creatures, human-animal hybrids that appear terrifyingly real. But this explanation fails when applied to daytime encounters by sober hunters, to multiple, simultaneous witnesses, or to physical evidence like destroyed camps and anomalous tracks. Unless one proposes widespread, coordinated hallucination affecting hundreds of people across decades, itself more fantastical than the creature, this hypothesis provides only partial answers. What keeps the Mapinguari hidden, if indeed it exists, is the Amazon's incomprehensible vastness and inhospitability. The basin spans 5.5 million square kilometers, an area larger than Western Europe. Of this, roughly 80% has never been systematically surveyed by scientists, and vast territories remain so remote that helicopter represents the only feasible access. Even seemingly explored regions contain pockets unreachable during dry season, inaccessible during floods, or so dense with vegetation that ground-level survey becomes impossible without massive resource investment. Consider the Javari Valley, frequently mentioned in Mapinguari accounts. This 85,000 square kilometer indigenous territory contains some of the Amazon's most isolated tribes and impenetrable terrain. Satellite imagery reveals canopy so thick that ground features remain invisible from above. During the wet season, water levels rise up to 15 meters, transforming solid ground into a labyrinth of flooded forest where navigation becomes nightmarish and many animals move to upland refuges unknown to outsiders. If Mapinguari populations exist in such refuges, seasonal inaccessibility combined with probable low population density would render encounters rare and documentation nearly impossible. The creature's reported behavior further aids concealment. Unlike curious or habituated animals that might approach human settlements or become photographed by camera traps, Mapinguari allegedly avoids all human contact except when defending territory. Indigenous accounts consistently describe it as solitary and primarily active during twilight hours, precisely when jungle visibility drops to meters and human activity minimizes. The olfactory warning system it supposedly employs means that most potential observers would flee before visual contact, and those who don't flee might become victims rather than witnesses, their testimony dying with them. Environmental factors assist concealment in ways outsiders struggle to appreciate. The Amazon's humidity and bacterial activity destroy organic evidence within days. A killed prey animal left by Mapinguari would be skeleton within a week, those bones scattered by scavengers and dissolved by acidic soil within months. Footprints in forest floor disappear under falling leaves within hours. Tracks in river mud wash away with the next rain. Even hair samples degrade rapidly in the tropics' heat and moisture, DNA breaking down before laboratory analysis becomes possible. Then there's the jungle's own defensive mechanisms. The Amazon actively resists human intrusion through a spectacular array of hazards: venomous snakes like the bushmaster that strike without warning, aggressive ant colonies that can drive a person from their campsite, parasitic infections from water sources, thorns that inject toxins, causing weeks of pain. These dangers mean that exploration occurs along established trails and rivers, avoiding the dense, dangerous interior where Mapinguari allegedly dwells. Satellite-based mapping can identify clearings and major rivers, but tells us nothing about what moves beneath the canopy's green roof. Cultural factors provide another layer of concealment. Many indigenous groups consider certain forest areas sacred or forbidden, refusing to enter them even when accompanied by researchers offering significant payment. The Caritiana maintain specific territories as spirit zones, where Mapinguari and other powerful beings reside, and their intimate knowledge of those regions dies with elders rather than being shared with outsiders. These zones might harbor exactly the evidence needed to resolve the mystery, but respect for indigenous sovereignty and spiritual beliefs rightly prevents forced access. Government regulations add bureaucratic barriers. Accessing remote Amazon territories requires permits from FUNAI, the National Indian Foundation, environmental agencies, and often military clearance for border regions. Approval processes can take years, and restrictions on activities, no collecting specimens, limited camping duration, mandatory indigenous guides who might refuse to enter certain areas, mean that even approved expeditions operate under significant constraints. These protections exist for excellent reasons: preventing exploitation, preserving indigenous autonomy, protecting ecosystems. But they also mean that cryptozoological investigation faces hurdles that normal zoological surveys don't encounter. Recent developments blur the line between folklore and possible reality. In 2007, satellite imaging revealed hundreds of geometric earthworks, enormous geometric shapes carved into the landscape, in acre state, previously invisible beneath forest canopy. These structures, created 2,000 years ago by civilizations we didn't know existed, demonstrated how thoroughly the jungle conceals history. If entire civilizations remained hidden until the 21st century, could a species? The discovery in 2013 of tapir species variations not previously catalogued, found through genetic analysis of populations separated by just hundreds of kilometers, revealed that Amazon biodiversity remains incompletely documented even for large mammals. Dr. Mario Coswell's work on Amazon mammal evolution showed that isolated populations developed into distinct species faster than previously believed, suggesting that pockets of unique fauna could persist undetected in refugia, exactly the scenario Mapinguari survival would require. Environmental DNA sampling, conducted since 2015 in various Amazon regions, occasionally returns genetic sequences that match no known organism. While most prove to be degraded samples or contamination, a handful of samples from the Javari Valley and Upper Purus regions contain mammalian DNA that doesn't align with any catalogued species. These tantalizing fragments lack sufficient data for species identification, but confirm that Amazon waters carry genetic signatures we can't yet explain. Could some belong to Mapinguari? The samples are too fragmented to answer, but they demonstrate that unknown large animals remaining undiscovered isn't scientifically impossible, just highly improbable. The role of indigenous knowledge in modern zoology has shifted dramatically. Where early researchers dismissed tribal accounts as superstition, contemporary scientists increasingly recognize that oral traditions preserve accurate ecological information. The lowland tapir's existence wasn't accepted by European science until 1819, despite centuries of indigenous documentation. The giant armadillo remained scientifically undescribed until 1804. The maned wolf, South America's largest canid, wasn't catalogued until 1815. In each case, indigenous people had detailed knowledge that Western science eventually validated, sometimes centuries later. This pattern suggests a responsible approach to the Mapinguari phenomenon, neither credulous acceptance nor dismissive rejection, but rather acknowledgement that indigenous observers might be documenting something science hasn't yet explained. Dr. Kirsten Silvius, who works with indigenous communities on wildlife monitoring, argues that when multiple independent sources with deep ecological expertise report the same phenomenon using precise detail, scientific humility demands we investigate before we dismiss. Modern expeditions seeking Mapinguari evidence face catch-22 scenarios. Camera traps require knowing where to place them, but the creature's alleged range spans hundreds of thousands of square kilometers. The expeditions with resources to deploy extensive trap networks lack local knowledge of promising territories, while indigenous guides with that knowledge often refuse to participate in hunts for sacred or feared beings. DNA sampling depends on finding fresh evidence, scat, hair, blood, but in an environment where such evidence degrades within days, the window for collection is desperately narrow. A 2019 expedition led by cryptozoologist Dr. Richard Freeman into the Javari Valley illustrates these challenges. Armed with thermal imaging cameras, extensive trap arrays, and indigenous guides willing to venture into suspected territories, the team spent 6 weeks searching. They documented jaguar, giant anteater, tapir, numerous primate species, but no Mapinguari. However, on their final night, thermal cameras recorded something moving through dense undergrowth approximately 80 meters from camp. The heat signature suggested an animal weighing between 180 to 220 kilograms, moving upright, about 2.5 meters tall. The footage runs 12 seconds before the subject disappears into terrain too dense for camera tracking. Analysis confirmed it wasn't human. The gait and proportions were wrong, and didn't match any catalogued Amazon mammal. Was it Mapinguari? The team remained agnostic, noting only that they documented something unexplained that merits further investigation. The truth, if such exists, might be more nuanced than cryptid exists or folklore.